At exactly 4:12 in the morning on a moonless Tuesday in late September, a refrigerated Kenworth semi-truck rolled south along Highway 83 through the Mesquite Flats of South Texas, 54 miles from the Guatemalan border. Behind the wheel sat Luke Holloway, 51 years old, Sheriff of Laredo County for the past 11 years, decorated veteran of the Gulf War, father of 2. In the trailer behind him, concealed inside industrial refrigeration units designed to transport frozen beef, sat $63 million in cartel cash, gold bullion, and encrypted cryptocurrency hardware wallets. Luke had just executed what federal investigators would later describe as one of the most audacious inside thefts in the history of organized crime in North America. He was 14 hours into a meticulously planned escape that would take him across 3 borders, into a new identity and, he believed, into permanent freedom. Then his burner phone vibrated on the passenger seat. One message, one photograph. His 13-year-old daughter, Leah, and his 9-year-old son, Cole, bound with zip ties, terrified, sitting on a concrete floor in a dimly lit basement. Below the image, a single line of text. "You've got 72 hours. Bring the money back or this is their last day on Earth." In that instant, Luke Holloway stopped being a fugitive and became something far more dangerous. A father with nothing left to lose and $63 million to spend hunting the men who had taken his blood. Before we go deeper into this chilling true story of corruption, desperation and revenge, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're fascinated by real crime documentaries that explore the dark psychology behind these cases, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? It's always incredible to see how far this community reaches. Now, let's return to the story. 3 months before that message arrived, Luke Holloway was living what criminal psychologists call a compartmentalized existence, a double life so carefully constructed that even those closest to him saw only the version he wanted them to see. By day, he wore the khaki uniform and silver star of a county sheriff, a position he had held through 3 consecutive elections. His office in downtown Laredo was decorated with commendations from the Texas Rangers, photographs of him shaking hands with governors and federal prosecutors, plaques recognizing his work on multi-agency task forces targeting drug trafficking along the Rio Grande corridor. Luke's public reputation was built on 23 years of service that had earned him the trust of voters, the respect of fellow officers, and a carefully cultivated image as one of the few law enforcement officials in the border region who could not be bought. By night, however, Luke Holloway was something entirely different. He was a paid intelligence asset for the Hermanos Delgo cartel, one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations operating along the US-Mexico border. For the previous 3 years, Luke had been providing the cartel with advance warning of federal investigations, detailed intelligence about law enforcement operations, and strategic guidance that helped them avoid detection and prosecution. In exchange, the cartel paid him approximately $40,000 per month, deposited through a network of shell corporations and cryptocurrency accounts that made the money virtually untraceable. Luke's corruption had not begun with grand ambitions or ideological motivations. It had started, like so many cases of institutional betrayal, with financial desperation and a series of choices that seemed, at the time, relatively minor. 3 years earlier, Luke's daughter Leah had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a particularly aggressive form of childhood cancer that required intensive chemotherapy, experimental treatments, and prolonged hospitalization. The medical bills had been staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars that quickly overwhelmed the family's insurance coverage and savings. At the same time, Luke's wife, Jenna, had been struggling to keep her small art gallery profitable in a city where discretionary spending on culture was limited and economic conditions were deteriorating. The gallery had been hemorrhaging money every month, draining what remained of their financial reserves and pushing the family toward bankruptcy. Luke had also developed a gambling problem. Modest at first, weekend trips to casinos in Louisiana, where he could convince himself he was just seeking temporary escape from the pressures of his work and family life. But the weekend trips had become weekly excursions, and the modest bets had escalated into high-stakes games where Luke regularly lost thousands of dollars that his family could not afford. By the time cartel representatives approached him with their offer, Luke was drowning in debt, medical bills, business losses, gambling debts, with no legal way to recover. The cartel's approach had been professional and sophisticated, demonstrating the kind of intelligence work that would have impressed federal investigators. They knew everything about Luke's financial situation before they made contact. They understood the pressures he was facing, the choices he had made, and the psychological vulnerabilities that made him a viable target for recruitment. The initial offer had seemed almost benign, $40,000 per month in exchange for what the cartel's representative described as advance warning about law enforcement activities that might affect our business operations. The representative had been careful to frame the arrangement as simply providing information that the cartel could probably obtain through other sources, making it seem less like criminal conspiracy and more like a business transaction between pragmatic adults. Luke had told himself that he was only sharing information about investigations that rarely resulted in significant arrests anyway, and that his cooperation was not really helping criminals, but simply providing them with intelligence they would acquire through other means. This rationalization, what forensic psychologists call moral disengagement, had allowed Luke to begin his corruption without fully acknowledging the gravity of what he was doing. The arrangement had started small, with Luke providing relatively innocuous information about the timing and scope of routine Border Patrol operations. But as the cartel came to trust Luke's reliability and discretion, his role gradually expanded. Within 6 months, Luke was providing detailed intelligence about DEA surveillance operations, identifying confidential informants who were cooperating with federal investigators and actively sabotaging investigations by altering evidence logs and providing false testimony that protected cartel operatives from prosecution. Luke's value to the organization increased dramatically as he demonstrated his willingness to take increasingly serious risks on their behalf. His monthly payments grew to $60,000 as the cartel recognized that Luke had become an essential component of their security infrastructure along the border. Luke was providing intelligence that allowed the cartel to stay consistently ahead of law enforcement pressure to identify and eliminate security threats before they could compromise operations and to maintain distribution networks that were generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Luke's corruption was methodical and sophisticated, reflecting both his law enforcement training and his understanding of how investigations worked. He had developed procedures for accessing and modifying official records without leaving digital traces that could be detected during routine audits. Luke used his administrative authority as sheriff to create false documentation that would justify his activities if they were ever questioned, and he ensured that investigations were systematically misdirected away from significant cartel operations. Luke's position gave him access to multi-agency intelligence databases, confidential informant files, and real-time communication about federal operations throughout South Texas. This access made him extraordinarily valuable to the cartel, which was willing to pay premium prices for the kind of strategic intelligence that could mean the difference between successful operations and devastating law enforcement raids. But Luke's carefully constructed double life began to unravel when his wife Jenna discovered evidence of his criminal activities during what she later described as a routine review of their household financial records. Jenna had noticed unexplained deposits, irregular cash payments, and communications with individuals whose names she recognized from news reports about organized crime in Mexico. Jenna's discovery had led her to conduct her own investigation, examining bank statements, email records, and Luke's personal communications until she had compiled what amounted to. Jenna's confrontation with Luke had been devastating and final. She had told him that she had suspected his involvement with criminals for months, but had hoped that her suspicions were wrong, that the man she had married and trusted for 15 years was not capable of the kind of betrayal she was now witnessing. Jenna had explained that she could not continue living with someone who was actively betraying everything he had sworn to protect, and that she would not allow their children to grow up believing their father was a hero when he was actually a criminal, profiting from violence and suffering. Jenna had given Luke an ultimatum: end his relationship with the cartel immediately and cooperate with federal authorities to expose their operations, or she would take their children and disappear permanently. Jenna had made it clear that she would not allow Laya and Cole to become collateral damage in Luke's criminal enterprise, and that she was prepared to enter witness protection if necessary to ensure their safety. Luke's attempt to negotiate with Jenna had failed completely. He had tried to explain that his cooperation with the cartel had been motivated by his desire to provide for his family and ensure that Laya received the medical treatment she needed to survive her cancer. Luke had argued that his corruption had actually protected his family from financial ruin and had given them opportunities they would never have had otherwise. But Jenna had rejected every rationalization, telling Luke that he had made choices that endangered their family far more than any financial hardship ever could. Jenna's final decision had been to take Laya and Cole to Canada, where she had relatives who could provide temporary shelter while she established a new life away from Luke and his criminal associations. Jenna had told Luke that she would not allow their children to be used as leverage against him by people who had no moral constraints on their use of violence. Luke had watched helplessly as Jenna loaded their frightened children into a rented car and drove away from the only home they had ever known. Luke had realized too late that his corruption had cost him everything that mattered to him, while providing him with money that was now worthless without his family to share it with. Luke's isolation and desperation in the weeks following his family's departure had led him to consider options that he had never contemplated during his years as a law enforcement officer. Luke had understood that the cartel would eventually eliminate him as a security risk once they no longer needed his services, and that federal authorities would probably discover his corruption and arrest him for crimes that would result in decades in federal prison. Luke's analysis of his situation had convinced him that his only realistic option was to steal enough money from the cartel to disappear permanently, while providing him with resources necessary to start a new life in a location where he could eventually reunite with his family. Luke had begun planning what would become one of the largest cash thefts in criminal history, a heist that would require him to use every bit of intelligence he had gathered during 3 years of cooperation with the cartel. Luke Holloway's position as sheriff of Laredo County had given him unprecedented access to information about cartel operations that most law enforcement officers never obtained. His 3 years of cooperation had provided him with detailed knowledge about money laundering networks, cash storage facilities, and transportation operations that moved enormous quantities of currency across international borders. Luke knew that the Hermanos Delgo cartel operated what was essentially an industrial-scale logistics operation for moving drug proceeds from distribution points throughout the United States back to financial networks in Mexico and Central America. The cartel moved cash through legitimate shipping operations that used refrigerated trucks, the same kind used to transport meat and produce, to disguise currency shipments as agricultural commerce. Luke had helped protect these operations by providing advance warning about inspection schedules and ensuring that certain vehicles received minimal scrutiny from Border Patrol agents and customs inspectors. Luke's intelligence about cartel operations had revealed that they typically stored between $50 and $80 million at their primary cash processing facility near Nuevo Laredo, a city just across the border from Luke's jurisdiction. This facility served as a consolidation point where money from drug sales throughout the United States was aggregated before being transferred to Mexican banking networks that would launder the funds through legitimate business operations. Luke had visited this facility several times during coordination meetings with cartel leadership, giving him detailed knowledge about the building's layout, security systems, and operational procedures. Luke knew about the refrigerated storage areas where cash was kept in industrial freezers that maintained the currency at temperatures that inhibited mold growth and degradation. He understood the guard rotations that protected the facility, the communication protocols that connected it to cartel leadership, and the transportation schedules that moved money to its final destinations throughout Mexico's financial system. Luke's plan had focused on intercepting a major cash shipment during the transportation phase, when the money would be most vulnerable to theft. Luke had identified a specific route that cartel trucks used to transport currency from the storage facility to distribution points throughout Mexico, and he had calculated that he could intercept such a shipment without being detected if he had sufficient advance warning about the timing and specific vehicle being used. Luke's access to law enforcement communications allowed him to monitor federal investigations and ensure that his theft would not coincide with any official operations that might complicate his escape. Luke could track DEA surveillance activities, border patrol deployment patterns, and interagency coordination efforts that might interfere with his plans. This intelligence gave him a significant advantage in timing his operation to avoid detection. Luke's most valuable asset in planning the theft had been his relationship with Miguel Santos, the cartel's transportation coordinator, who was responsible for scheduling and routing cash shipments throughout the organization's distribution network. Miguel had trusted Luke completely because of their 3-year working relationship and Luke's proven reliability as a source of security intelligence. Miguel regularly shared information about upcoming operations because he believed that Luke's law enforcement position made him an ideal source for identifying potential threats to their transportation operations. Luke had used this relationship carefully, gathering information over several months about the patterns and procedures used for major cash movements. Luke had learned that the cartel planned to move approximately $63 million in a single shipment, an unusually large amount that represented accumulated proceeds from drug sales throughout Texas and the southwestern United States over several months. This shipment would include not only cash but also gold bullion and cryptocurrency hardware wallets that represented the cartel's diversification into digital assets. Luke's plan had required him to create a plausible explanation for his presence along the transportation route at the exact time when the cash shipment would be vulnerable to interception. Luke's solution had been to arrange a fake law enforcement operation that would provide cover for his criminal activities while ensuring that no legitimate officers would interfere with his theft. Luke had used his administrative authority to create false documentation about a joint operation between local and federal agencies, a fictional investigation that would require him to conduct surveillance along specific highway routes during the time window when the cartel shipment would be moving through his jurisdiction. Luke's false operation had been sophisticated enough to pass casual scrutiny from other law enforcement personnel while providing him with official justification for being in exactly the right place at the right time. But Luke had also recognized that he needed to neutralize the security team protecting the cash shipment without causing violence that might trigger intensive investigation by law enforcement agencies. Luke's solution had been to recruit the guards themselves, offering them more money than they were earning from the cartel in exchange for their cooperation in his theft. Luke's recruitment of the security team had been facilitated by his knowledge of their personal financial situations and their growing dissatisfaction with working conditions within the cartel organization. Luke had offered each guard enough money to relocate permanently to locations where they would be safe from cartel retaliation, while providing them with resources to start legitimate businesses or simply disappear into comfortable anonymity. The guards had been pragmatic enough to recognize that their loyalty to the cartel was transactional rather than ideological, and that Luke's offer represented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to escape a dangerous profession with enough money to never work again. Luke's planning had also included detailed procedures for moving and concealing $63 million in stolen assets while avoiding detection by both law enforcement and cartel investigators. Luke had studied money laundering techniques, international banking regulations, and the logistics of moving large quantities of physical currency across international borders. He had identified transportation resources, established secure communication channels, and prepared multiple contingency options that would allow him to reach safety even if some aspects of his theft operation were discovered or compromised. Luke had prepared false identification documents, researched countries with limited extradition agreements with the United States, and established financial accounts that would allow him to access his stolen assets from anywhere in the world. The theft of $63 million began at exactly 11:47 on a moonless Tuesday night, when Luke Holloway activated the fake law enforcement operation that would provide cover for the most audacious crime of his career. Luke's official radio communications indicated that he was conducting surveillance related to a joint federal investigation, giving him legitimate justification for being alone on a remote highway 40 miles south of Laredo. Luke had positioned himself at a predetermined location where Miguel Santos had told him the cash shipment would pass during its journey from the storage facility to distribution points in central Mexico. Luke's timing had been perfect. The refrigerated truck carrying $63 million arrived exactly when Miguel had predicted it would. Luke had activated his emergency lights and pulled the truck over using his authority as a county sheriff, a traffic stop that appeared entirely routine to anyone who might have been monitoring police communications. The driver and security guards had recognized Luke immediately because they had worked with him during previous operations, and they had no reason to suspect that this traffic stop was anything other than a security check designed to protect their operation from federal surveillance. Luke had explained that he had received intelligence about federal agents conducting surveillance along this route, and that he needed to inspect the truck to ensure it contained only legitimate cargo that would not attract official attention. Luke's explanation had been entirely plausible, because the guards knew that he regularly provided advance warning about law enforcement activities that might threaten cartel operations. Luke's inspection of the truck had revealed exactly what he had expected based on Miguel's information: dozens of sealed containers that appeared to hold frozen meat products but actually contained cash gold bars and electronic storage devices holding cryptocurrency assets worth tens of millions of dollars. Luke had told the guards that he needed to examine the cargo more thoroughly at a secure location, where they would not be observed by federal surveillance teams that might be monitoring the highway. Luke had directed the driver to follow him to an abandoned truck stop facility that Luke had prepared specifically for the final phase of his operation. At the truck stop, Luke had implemented the plan that he had spent months developing with the cooperation of the security team that was supposed to be protecting the cartel's assets. The guards had helped Luke transfer the genuine cargo to his own refrigerated truck, while loading the original vehicle with containers filled with sand and concrete blocks that would maintain the correct weight distribution and pass casual inspection. The cargo transfer operation had taken exactly 43 minutes to complete. Luke's preparation had been so thorough that every container was replaced with a decoy that would pass superficial examination while concealing the fact that millions of dollars in cartel money had been stolen. Luke had even prepared replacement seals and shipping labels that would make the decoy cargo appear authentic unless someone conducted a detailed physical inspection of every container. Luke's stolen cargo had included approximately $38 million in cash bundled for international transport, $12 million worth of gold bars marked with cartel identification symbols, and electronic storage devices containing cryptocurrency assets worth another $13 million. Luke had successfully intercepted one of the largest single shipments of criminal proceeds in the history of organized crime in North America. The guards who had assisted Luke were paid their promised compensation, each receiving $500,000 in cash, along with detailed instructions for reaching safe havens where they could disappear permanently. Luke had researched witness protection procedures and international refuge options to ensure that the guards could survive cartel retaliation if their cooperation was discovered. Luke's original plan had called for him to drive the stolen money to a private airfield near the Guatemalan border, where he had arranged for charter transportation to a country that did not have extradition treaties with the United States. Luke had prepared false identification documents, established financial accounts in jurisdictions with strong banking privacy laws, and researched communities where wealthy expatriates could live comfortably without attracting official attention. Luke had been driving toward the Guatemalan border, approximately 14 hours into his escape, when his burner phone received the message that would transform his brilliant theft into a desperate rescue mission. The photograph of his children, bound and terrorized in an unknown basement location, had made Luke realize that the cartel had anticipated his betrayal and had taken measures to ensure his cooperation even after he had stopped working for them. Luke's immediate reaction had been rage, pure incandescent fury at the men who had taken his children to punish him for his theft. But that rage had quickly been tempered by the cold calculation that had made him successful during 23 years in law enforcement. Luke had understood that the cartel had probably been monitoring his family since Jenna's departure to Canada, and had been prepared to use his children as leverage if Luke ever attempted to betray the organization. Luke had also realized that the cartel's ultimatum was probably not sincere, that they would likely kill his children regardless of whether he returned the stolen money, because both he and his family now represented unacceptable security risks to their operations. Luke's law enforcement experience had taught him that criminal organizations typically eliminated security threats even when their demands were met, and Luke had understood that compliance with the cartel's ultimatum would probably not save his family's lives. Luke's decision to abandon his escape plan and return to search for his children had been motivated by his understanding that his only realistic option was to use his stolen resources to fund a private war against the people who had taken his children. The abduction of Laya and Cole Holloway had been planned with the same professional precision that characterized all of the Hermanos Delgo cartel's operations. The organization had been monitoring Jenna Holloway and her children since they had arrived in Canada 3 months earlier, waiting for the optimal moment to acquire leverage that could be used against Luke if he ever attempted to betray his criminal employers. The cartel's surveillance of the Holloway family had revealed their daily routines, security arrangements, and the specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited during a kidnapping operation. The cartel had known that Jenna had hired a private security consultant to protect her children, but they had also known that this protection was minimal and could be easily overcome by professional criminals with experience in abduction operations. The kidnapping had taken place on a Tuesday afternoon, when Laya and Cole were visiting Riverfront Park in Ottawa with their security escort David Chen, a retired police officer who had been hired through a legitimate security company and had no idea that his clients were being stalked by international criminals. The cartel's kidnapping team had consisted of 4 men who had extensive experience with abduction operations and who understood how to acquire targets without triggering intensive law enforcement responses that might complicate their mission. The team had studied the park's layout, identified escape routes, and prepared equipment that would allow them to complete their mission quickly and efficiently. The abduction had begun when 2 team members approached David Chen from different directions while he was supervising the children near the park's playground area. The attackers had used non-lethal weapons, conducted electrical weapons commonly known as tasers, to incapacitate David without causing injuries that would require immediate medical attention or generate excessive law enforcement interest in the incident. Laya and Cole had been taken during the brief window when David was unconscious and unable to protect them. The children had been moved to a van that was waiting in the park's parking area and were transported to a secure location where they could be held until Luke complied with the cartel's demands or until they were no longer useful as leverage. The kidnapping had been designed to appear like a random crime rather than a targeted operation against specific individuals. The cartel had wanted local police to treat the disappearance as a conventional missing persons case rather than as an international incident that might attract federal attention or cooperation between American and Canadian law enforcement agencies. David Chen's injuries had been consistent with a mugging or random assault, and his initial statements to police had indicated that he had been attacked by unknown criminals who might have been motivated by robbery rather than kidnapping. David had no memory of the actual abduction and could provide no useful information about the perpetrators or their methods, a common consequence of conducted electrical weapon use that the cartel's team had anticipated. Jenna's initial reaction to her children's disappearance had been to assume that Luke's criminal associates had taken them to pressure him into continued cooperation or to punish him for any attempt to withdraw from their operations. Jenna had immediately contacted both Canadian and American law enforcement agencies to report her suspicions about the kidnapping's true purpose, but Jenna's attempts to interest law enforcement in investigating the cartel connection had been unsuccessful because she had no concrete evidence linking the disappearance to organized crime activities. Canadian police had treated the case as a conventional kidnapping and had focused their investigation on local criminals who might have targeted wealthy American families for ransom purposes. The investigation had been thorough, but had produced no useful leads. No witnesses had come forward with information about the abduction, no ransom demands had been received through normal channels, and forensic examination of the crime scene had revealed no physical evidence that could identify the perpetrators. The cartel's communication with Luke had been designed to provide unmistakable proof that they had taken his children while avoiding any statements that could be used as evidence in legal proceedings. The photograph that Luke received had shown his children in a basement location that could not be identified from visible details, and the accompanying message had contained no specific threats that would constitute actionable criminal violations under US or Canadian law. Luke's law enforcement training had allowed him to analyze the photograph for clues about his children's location and condition. Luke had been able to see that Laya and Cole appeared to be physically uninjured, but were obviously terrified and had probably been given minimal food and water during their captivity. Luke had also noted details about the basement's construction: concrete block walls, exposed utility pipes, fluorescent lighting that might help identify the building where they were being held. Luke's immediate response had been to attempt negotiations with the cartel through the communication channels that he had used during his 3 years of cooperation. Luke had tried to reach Miguel Santos and other cartel representatives to discuss terms for his children's release, but none of his usual contacts had responded to his messages. Luke had realized that the cartel had probably decided to eliminate him as a security risk, regardless of whether he returned the stolen money. Luke's knowledge of their operations and his law enforcement connections made him too dangerous to be allowed to survive, and the kidnapping of his children was probably designed to ensure his cooperation during the final phase of their plan to kill him. Luke's decision to abandon his escape plan and search for his children had been based on his understanding that compliance with the cartel's demands would not guarantee their safety. Luke had known that criminal organizations typically eliminated witnesses even when their demands were met, and Luke had realized that his family's only chance for survival was for him to locate and rescue them before the cartel's 72-hour deadline expired. Luke Holloway's transformation from corrupt sheriff to avenging father had begun when he abandoned his refrigerated truck containing $63 million in stolen cartel money at a remote location near the Guatemala-Mexico border. Luke had realized that money was worthless if his children were dead, and he had committed himself to using every resource at his disposal to find Laya and Cole before the cartel's deadline expired. Luke's first priority had been gathering intelligence about the cartel's operations in Mexico and identifying locations where they might be holding American hostages. Luke's law enforcement background had taught him about investigative techniques and intelligence gathering methods that would be crucial for tracking down his children in a foreign country controlled by criminal organizations. Luke had used his knowledge of cartel operations to identify likely locations where high-value hostages would be held during kidnapping operations. The cartel maintained secure facilities throughout northern Mexico that were used for interrogations, negotiations, and eliminations when their criminal activities required extreme measures against security threats. Luke's investigation had begun with Jose Martinez, a mid-level cartel operative who managed security operations at ranches and warehouses throughout the border region. Luke had worked with Jose during his years of cooperation and knew that Jose had access to information about special operations that required maximum security and discretion. Luke's approach to Jose had been direct and violent. Luke had used his law enforcement training and equipment to overcome Jose's security measures and to extract information about current cartel operations that might involve American hostages. Luke's interrogation techniques had been brutal but effective, providing him with specific intelligence about facilities where his children might be held. Jose's information had led Luke to a ranch complex near Nuevo Laredo, where the cartel conducted sensitive operations that required isolation from official scrutiny. Jose had told Luke that this facility was currently being used for a special project involving American targets, but Jose had claimed that he did not know specific details about the hostages or their eventual fate, a claim that Luke had not entirely believed but had been unable to disprove through continued interrogation. Luke's assault on the ranch facility had been planned and executed with the precision of a military operation. Luke had used his knowledge of cartel security procedures to identify vulnerabilities in their defensive arrangements and to develop attack strategies that would allow him to penetrate their perimeter without triggering alarms that might result in his children being eliminated as a precaution. Luke's attack on the ranch had begun before dawn, when most of the guards would be tired and less alert after a night shift. Luke had used suppressed weapons and night vision equipment purchased on the black market to eliminate perimeter security without attracting attention from personnel inside the main buildings. Luke's military-style tactics, learned during his service in the Gulf War and refined during years of law enforcement training, had allowed him to neutralize 6 guards without triggering any response from the facility's command structure. Luke's search of the ranch buildings had revealed extensive evidence of criminal activities, including weapon storage, drug processing equipment, and communication systems that connected the facility to cartel operations throughout Mexico and the United States. But Luke had found no trace of his children or any indication that American hostages had been held at this location. Luke's interrogation of surviving ranch personnel had provided information about other facilities where high-value hostages might be held during special operations. Luke had learned about a warehouse complex in Monterrey that was used for operations requiring maximum security, and that was managed by cartel specialists who handled sensitive negotiations and eliminations. Luke's intelligence gathering had also revealed the identity of Carlos Mendez, a former ICE agent who had been corrupted by the cartel and was now providing them with expertise about American law enforcement procedures and hostage management techniques. Carlos had been involved in planning the kidnapping operation and would have knowledge about where Luke's children were being held. Luke's hunt for Carlos had required him to use his law enforcement contacts to track down someone who was actively avoiding detection by both criminal organizations and federal agencies. Luke had discovered that Carlos was living under a false identity in San Antonio and was working as a security consultant while maintaining his secret relationship with the cartel. Luke's confrontation with Carlos had taken place at Carlos's apartment in San Antonio, where Luke had used enhanced interrogation techniques to extract information about the kidnapping operation and his children's current location. Carlos had initially claimed ignorance about the operation, but Luke's persuasive methods, which included techniques that would be considered torture under international law, had eventually convinced him to provide detailed information about the cartel's plans. Carlos had revealed that Lyer and Cole were being held at a secure facility in Monterrey that was used exclusively for high-value hostages who might be needed for extended negotiations or psychological pressure operations. Carlos had also told Luke that the cartel had no intention of releasing the children alive, regardless of whether Luke returned the stolen money. Carlos had explained that the cartel viewed Luke's family as security risks who possessed too much knowledge about their operations to be allowed to survive. Luke's final interrogation of Carlos had provided him with detailed information about the Monterrey facility, including its location, security arrangements, and the number of guards who would be protecting his children. Carlos had also provided Luke with intelligence about the facility's layout and the specific room where American hostages were typically held during extended operations. Luke Holloway's assault on the cartel facility in Monterrey had been planned as a precision operation that would maximize his chances of rescuing his children while minimizing the risk that they would be harmed during the fighting. Luke's law enforcement and military training had taught him about hostage rescue techniques and urban warfare tactics that would be crucial for penetrating a heavily defended facility. Luke's reconnaissance of the warehouse complex had revealed that it was protected by sophisticated security measures, including electronic surveillance, armed guards, and communication systems that could summon reinforcements from other cartel facilities throughout the region. Luke had realized that he would have only minutes to complete his mission before overwhelming enemy forces arrived. Luke's attack plan had focused on creating multiple diversions that would confuse the facility's defenders while allowing him to approach the building where his children were being held. Luke had used improvised explosive devices and arson attacks to create chaos that would draw guards away from critical areas while providing cover for his infiltration of the main facility. Luke's entry into the warehouse complex had been accomplished through a service entrance that had been identified during his reconnaissance activities. Luke had used his knowledge of commercial building layouts to navigate through the facility without being detected by guards who were responding to the diversionary attacks he had created. Luke's search for his children had required him to systematically clear multiple rooms while avoiding detection by guards who were patrolling the facility in response to the ongoing emergency. Luke had used suppressed weapons and non-lethal techniques whenever possible to avoid creating noise that might alert other defenders to his presence. Luke's discovery of Laya and Cole in a basement storage room had been both relief and horror. His children were alive, but showed clear signs of psychological trauma from their captivity. Luke could see that they had been provided with minimal food and water and had been kept in conditions that were designed to break their spirits and make them compliant hostages. Luke's reunion with his children had been brief because he understood that cartel reinforcements would arrive within minutes and that their only chance for survival was immediate evacuation from the facility. Luke had prepared emergency supplies and transportation that would allow them to reach safety before the cartel could organize an effective pursuit. Luke's extraction from the warehouse complex had required him to fight his way through guards who were attempting to prevent his escape. Luke's combat experience had allowed him to overcome multiple defenders while protecting his children from the violence that surrounded their rescue operation. Luke's escape vehicle had been a modified pickup truck that he had prepared with improvised armor plating and emergency medical supplies that might be needed if his children had been injured during their captivity. Luke's driving skills and knowledge of Monterey's street layout had allowed him to evade pursuit vehicles while reaching a safe house that he had prepared for emergency situations. Luke's safe house had been a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood where he could provide his children with immediate medical attention while planning their evacuation from Mexico. Luke had prepared this location with supplies that would allow them to survive for several days, while he arranged transportation that would take them beyond the reach of cartel retaliation. Luke's examination of his children had revealed that they had been physically unharmed during their captivity, but had suffered severe psychological trauma that would require professional treatment. Laya and Cole had been initially unable to speak coherently about their experiences and had shown clear signs of the terror they had endured during their imprisonment, symptoms that mental health professionals would later identify as acute stress disorder with potential for long-term post-traumatic stress. Luke's priority had been providing his children with immediate psychological support, while planning their escape from Mexico to a location where they could receive proper medical care and protection from further cartel attacks. Luke had understood that his family would never be safe as long as the Hermanos Delgo cartel continued to operate, and that his theft and the subsequent rescue operation had marked his family for permanent elimination. Luke's communication with his children during their first hours of freedom had been limited because they were still processing the trauma of their kidnapping and rescue. Luke had focused on providing them with reassurance about their safety while avoiding detailed discussions about the violence that had been necessary to secure their freedom. Luke's preparation for leaving Mexico had included acquiring false identification documents that would allow his family to cross international borders without being detected by law enforcement agencies or cartel operatives who might be monitoring official immigration checkpoints. Luke Holloway's evacuation of his children from Mexico had required the same careful planning and execution that had characterized his theft of $63 million and his rescue operation in Monterey. Luke had understood that the cartel would spare no expense to track down his family, and that conventional escape routes would be monitored by criminal organizations with extensive intelligence networks throughout Mexico and Central America. Luke's escape plan had utilized a private aviation network that specialized in providing transportation for wealthy clients who valued discretion and were willing to pay premium prices for services that avoided official scrutiny. Luke had researched these services during his planning for the original theft and had established contacts who could provide immediate assistance in emergency situations. Luke's contact in the private aviation network had been Maria Santos, a flight coordinator who operated from a small airfield near Guatemala City and who had built her business by asking no questions about her clients' backgrounds or destinations. Maria's services had included false flight plans, modified aircraft identifications, and coordination with ground personnel who understood the importance of discretion in handling sensitive transportation requests. Luke's arrangement with Maria had included transportation for 3 passengers from Guatemala to the Philippines, with stops for refueling, and documentation changes that would make it impossible for anyone to track their complete journey. Luke had chosen the Philippines as their destination because the country had limited extradition agreements with the United States, maintained banking privacy laws that would protect their financial assets, and had large expatriate communities where wealthy foreigners could live comfortably without attracting excessive official attention. Luke's journey to Guatemala City had required him to transport his traumatized children across dangerous territory while avoiding detection by cartel operatives who were certainly searching for them throughout northern Mexico. Luke had used his knowledge of smuggling routes and border-crossing techniques, intelligence he had gathered during his years of cooperation with the cartel, to reach Guatemala without being discovered by his pursuers. Luke's children had begun to recover from their initial trauma during the journey to Guatemala, but they had remained largely silent about their captivity and had shown obvious signs of severe psychological distress that would require professional intervention. Luke had realized that Laya and Cole would require extensive therapy and counseling to help them process their experiences and rebuild their trust in adults and authority figures. Luke's reunion with his children had been complicated by their awareness that his criminal activities had been directly responsible for their kidnapping and suffering. Laya and Cole had understood that their father's theft of cartel money had made them targets for retaliation, and they had struggled to reconcile their love for Luke with their anger about the consequences of his choices. Luke's attempt to explain his actions to his children had been painful and largely unsuccessful. Luke had tried to help them understand that his theft had been motivated by his desire to provide them with a better life, away from the violence and corruption that had consumed his career. But Laya and Cole had been too traumatized to appreciate the complexity of his motivations. Luke's arrival in the Philippines had marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives as a family in hiding. Luke had prepared financial resources and documentation that would allow them to establish a comfortable lifestyle while remaining invisible to both law enforcement agencies and criminal organizations that might be searching for them. Luke's choice of Cebu as their permanent residence had been based on the city's large expatriate community, minimal law enforcement presence, and banking institutions that could provide financial services without extensive background investigations. Luke had researched the location extensively and had determined that it offered the best combination of security and lifestyle opportunities for his family. Luke's establishment of their new life in the Philippines had included purchasing a modest home in a gated community, enrolling his children in international schools that catered to expatriate families, and creating legitimate business operations that would provide cover for their presence in the country. Luke had established himself as a security consultant for foreign businesses operating in Southeast Asia, a role that was plausible given his law enforcement background and that allowed him to explain his financial resources without attracting suspicious attention. Luke's planning had been so thorough that they could live comfortably on the interest from their stolen assets without ever accessing the principal amounts. The $63 million had been carefully distributed across multiple financial institutions in jurisdictions with strong banking privacy laws, making it virtually impossible for authorities to trace or recover the stolen funds. Luke's relationship with his children had slowly begun to improve as they adjusted to their new environment and began to understand that their father had risked everything to rescue them from their captors. Laya and Cole had gradually come to appreciate that Luke's criminal activities had been motivated by love rather than greed, even though the consequences had been devastating for their family. Luke's children had eventually found ways to process their experiences and to build new relationships with their father based on honest discussions about his choices and their consequences. The family's recovery had been slow and difficult, requiring professional therapy for all 3 family members and patient reconstruction of trust that had been shattered by trauma and betrayal. Luke had been honest with his children about the nature of his corruption, the choices he had made, and the reasons why he had believed those choices were necessary at the time. This honesty, painful as it was, had formed the foundation for their eventual healing as a family. 6 months after their arrival in the Philippines, Laya had told Luke something that represented a turning point in their relationship. "You're a monster, Dad, but you're our monster." This acknowledgement had recognized both the darkness of Luke's actions and the depth of his love for his children, an acceptance that allowed them to begin building a new life together while acknowledging the permanent scars of their shared trauma. Luke Holloway's story represents one of the most complex cases of corruption, theft, and redemption in modern criminal history. His transformation from decorated law enforcement officer to cartel informant, from desperate thief to avenging father, illustrates the moral complexities that can arise when institutional pressures, personal desperation, and family loyalty collide. The case also demonstrates the sophisticated intelligence capabilities that modern criminal organizations possess. The Hermanos Delgo cartel's ability to monitor Luke's family across international borders, to plan and execute a professional kidnapping operation in a foreign country, and to maintain operational security, despite Luke's law enforcement background, reveals the evolution of organized crime into something resembling a parallel intelligence service. Federal investigators who eventually pieced together the full scope of Luke's corruption estimated that his intelligence sharing with the cartel had allowed them to avoid prosecution in dozens of cases and had contributed to the continued operation of distribution networks that generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. The financial impact of Luke's theft was significant for the cartel. $63 million represented a substantial portion of their liquid assets and caused temporary disruption to their money laundering operations. However, the organization's decentralized financial structure and access to alternative revenue sources allowed them to absorb the loss without significant long-term consequences. Luke's case also highlighted systemic vulnerabilities in law enforcement institutions along the US-Mexico border. The ease with which Luke was able to corrupt evidence, manipulate investigations, and provide intelligence to criminal organizations revealed inadequate oversight mechanisms and institutional cultures that sometimes prioritized political relationships over rigorous accountability. Investigators who reviewed Luke's activities after his disappearance identified numerous red flags that should have triggered internal investigations, but were ignored or overlooked by supervisory personnel who trusted Luke's reputation and public image. The psychological dimensions of Luke's story raise profound questions about moral responsibility, family loyalty, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior when protecting loved ones. Luke's initial corruption was driven by desperate circumstances, medical bills, business failures, gambling debts, that many people could understand, even if they could not condone his choices. His decision to steal from the cartel rather than continue cooperating with them could be seen as a form of redemption or as merely a different form of criminal self-interest. His willingness to wage a private war to rescue his children demonstrated a capacity for violence and determination that exceeded anything he had shown during his law enforcement career. The case also illustrates the limitations of justice systems when dealing with crimes that cross international boundaries and involve non-state actors with sophisticated operational capabilities. Luke Holloway was never arrested, never prosecuted, and never held accountable through any formal legal process for his corruption, theft, or the violence he committed during his rescue operation. His ability to disappear with his children and stolen money represents a kind of escape that would be impossible for most criminals, but that was facilitated by his law enforcement training, his intelligence-gathering capabilities, and his access to substantial financial resources. The long-term consequences of Luke's actions extended far beyond his own family. The cartel operatives whose deaths he caused during his rescue operation left behind their own families, people who bore no responsibility for the organization's criminal activities, but who suffered the consequences of the violence that characterized the criminal underworld. The guards whom Luke recruited to assist with his theft faced permanent exile from their communities and constant fear of cartel retaliation, even after receiving substantial financial compensation. The law enforcement institutions that Luke betrayed suffered damage to their credibility and effectiveness that took years to repair. Luke's story ultimately represents a case study in the corrupting influence of desperation, the destructive power of compartmentalized moral reasoning, and the extraordinary lengths to which parents will go to protect their children. His transformation from respected law enforcement officer to international fugitive occurred through a series of incremental choices, each of which seemed rational at the time, but which collectively led him down a path from which there was no honorable return. The fact that Luke Holloway ultimately succeeded in rescuing his children and escaping accountability for his crimes does not diminish the moral complexity of his story, or the devastating human costs of the choices he made.